Wait, how many of these videos does she have? I mean, but the thing too, like, and what I hate, this is part three. What I hate though too is like people act as if she just shitted on games nonstop and didn't do stuff like, well, here are some positive examples. Here are some things that I like that I hope keep happening. People were just like, she hates video games. She's not a real gamer. Like no one was actually listening to the argument. Okay, when I watch this intro every fucking time though.
Because of many popular games and characters. But please keep in mind that as well as topic, we've discussions of blockbusters. To save a dude in distress? Well, yes, they do exist. However, since female protagonists starring in their own games are already few and far between,
there should be much more positive. The whole point, Big Dog, is that wasn't a thing though. It wasn't a thing though. Like, that's what I'm saying. We have to be real about this shit too. There isn't a surplus of games where the women are rescuing men, where the men are damsels in distresses, where there are dudes in distress, where they need rescuing for a significant portion. It's not the same. It's just like if I talked about a superhero movie starring white characters and a superhero movie starring black characters. I would run out of black characters before I would even think about running out of white characters. Like you got to understand, like, this is just real shit. This is just real shit, man. Lots of video game characters are white dudes. White dudes who all kind of have the same phenotype and who talk gruff and who shoot people. That's a ton, right? How many black video game leads do you know off the top of your head? Besides like CJ Bear and Everett from fucking The Walking Dead, right? It's not to say they don't exist, but we have to look at the realness. There's an almost an infinite number of one versus the other.
In which women work to save men in peril are extremely rare. Back in our first episode, I mentioned that Princess Peach is the star of exactly one platformer. That game is called Super Princess Peach, and it was released in 2006 for the Nintendo DS handheld system.
Once upon a time, princesses were called to rescue two captured plumbers. They trained intensely to master the skills necessary for survival. If you can stand up to
By the way, they would call this woke because there's black people in this for Princess Peach, by the way. They would call this commercial woke.
Really mean people. Maybe you have what it takes to be a princess.
The premise is a simple inversion of the standard franchise formula, with Bowser abducting Mario and Luigi, while Peach is tasked with their rescue this time. So finally, after being kidnapped in 13 separate Super Mario games...
You know what, though? Peach I do like the fact that, like, when Peach has to rescue him, they give her double duty. Like, Mario just had to rescue Peach. She had to rescue Mario and fucking Luigi? Damn, dude. She has to do twice the work as a man just to get the respect. Listen, Nintendo, I see what you were doing in 2006. I see what you were doing, and I respect it. I respect it.
To be the hero for once. But don't get too excited, because everything else about the game ends up in a train wreck of gendered stereotypes. Nintendo introduced a new gameplay mechanic for Peach where the player can choose from 4 special powers, or vibes as they're called. And you know what those powers are? Her mood swings. That's right, Peach's powers are her out-of-control, frantic female emotions. She can throw a temper tantrum and rage her enemies to death, or bawl her eyes out and wash the bad guys away with tears. Essentially, Nintendo has turned a PMS joke into their core gameplay mechanic. As if that weren't bad enough, Peach is not even featured in any of the game's narrative cutscenes. Instead, they all focus on the backstory of her Parasol, who it turns out is really a cursed boy named Perry. So while it's definitely nice to see Peach starring in her own adventure, the dude in distress role reversal premise here feels like it's just intended as a lighthearted joke or niche market novelty. Similar gender inversion plot devices have been used in a handful of games over the years, including Balloon Kid for the original Game Boy, in which Alice must search for her lost little brother. Part of the plot of Kaya Dark Lineage revolves around finding Kaya's half-brother Frank.
It was crypt. All right, real talk, man. I feel like you're kind of doing the thing that I was telling you guys what was happening when the shit came out. It's like, is it creative of her powers? Sure. But then I can just ask, why was her power her emotions though? Why wasn't like, I don't know, she's a princess, doesn't she have magic or some shit? Like, this is post Super Smash Brothers. Why doesn't she have like magic to use? Or why can't she use XYZ? Why couldn't just like, you see what I'm talking about? Like if I said this is the game starring a black guy and his powers are going to be he can drink a purple drink, he can eat watermelon and chicken, he can get a basketball and it makes him more athletic, and then here's a gun. Yeah, you could say that's a creative power use, but then you'd be like, hey, why the fuck are you using these stereotypes for your black character? Like, that's what you're missing.
I never thought I'd see you again.
Frank! I'm gonna get you out of here.
In Primal, Jennifer Tate travels to demonic realms in an attempt to save her kidnapped boyfriend, Lewis. In one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil, Jade's side
which is never getting a sequel,
captured and held prisoner for a portion of the adventure. It's probably not a coincidence that the majority of these titles were produced and released during the run of the popular TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which led the girl power trend in mass media.
She did bring up her powers being emotions.
Media entertainment that briefly took hold in the late 1990s and early 2000s. You might remember Charmed, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or the British pop sensations the Spice Girls, who in many ways exemplified the phenomenon.
In a wonder bra. I mean, what? I'm a manly man. I've never seen Spice World. I've never seen this movie. What are you talking about?
This decade, however, games featuring the dude in distress gender inversion have been few and far between. One rare example is the 2007 indie game Aquaria, in which Naja travels through an underwater world, making sushi, learning about her past, and must eventually rescue her love interest Lee. So what is the difference between traditional narratives that place female characters in powerless positions and stories in which a male character requires rescuing by a woman? On the surface, the dude in distress and the damsel in distress may appear similar. However, they're not actually equivalent. To understand why they're different, we need to examine the broader historical and cultural implications of the two plot devices. First, there's been
one is used as a joke, if we're being completely honest. The dude in distress is either used as a joke or specifically exists as a subversion, an inversion of the damsel in distress trope. Damsel in distress trope is much more established, so it already has that built-in emotional core, right? Especially in a heteronormative society, whereas a woman rescuing a man is always going to be played as something just a little bit different, but not taking that seriously.
No shortage of men in leading or heroic roles in video games, or in any other creative medium for that matter. In fact, one recent study found that only about 4% of modern titles are exclusively designed around a woman in the leading role. Since men are still largely the default for protagonists, the rare dude in distress plotline does not add to any long-standing gender tradition in storytelling.
Also, how hard is it to fucking capture Mario? Like he's saying we finally caught him. Was he that hard to catch in the first time? Like, this nigga's a plumber. The minute he warps in, like Bowser could just swoop him up.
This plotline does not add to any long-standing gender tradition in storytelling.
And this is what, by the way, this is what I was talking about. I said what she said right here. I'm gonna shut up now, but this is what I was talking about.
Role. Since men are still largely the default for protagonists, the rare dude in distress plotline does not add to any long-standing gender tradition in storytelling. Second, and perhaps more importantly, damseled female characters tend to reinforce
He can jump 18 feet high. Yeah, and Bowser can breathe fucking fire. Like, no. The Hammer Bros can throw shit 80 feet into the air, all right? The sun can kill him. There's a lot of ways Mario should have been captured.
Existing regressive notions about women as a group being weak or in need of protection because of their gender. While stories with the occasional helpless male character do not perpetuate anything negative about men as a group, since there's no long-standing stereotype of men being weak or incapable because of their gender. To help illustrate this point, let's quickly take a look at the indie game Spelunky. Originally released in 2009, the game included a stereotypical damsel in distress as a gameplay mechanic, whose rescue rewarded the player with bonus health. The 2012 HD remake of the game for Xbox Live again features the stock character damsel, complete with newly upgraded boob jiggle. However, this time an option was added to the menu that allows players to select a replacement for the default woman in peril by switching to either a Chippendale-style hunk or a dog instead. Setting aside the fact that if a female character is easily interchangeable with a dog, then
Yeah, it's not
it's probably a pretty
really
good
good.
indication that something is wrong. Merely providing an optional gender swap is not a quick and easy fix, especially where stock character-style damsels are concerned. The two may appear the same, but they don't mean the same thing in our culture. This is still a problem, while this is not. Again, because one reinforces pre-existing stereotypes about women, while the other does not reinforce any pre-existing stereotypes about men. In recent years, we've also seen a number
Fair.
of news stories about fans who've taken it upon themselves to switch the gender roles in classic-era games by manipulating the code. There's Mike Micah's Donkey
Mario is that guy. Listen, all I'm saying is, if Bowser wanted to, you go to World 1-1, all right? You scoop that little nigga up and you tie him. That's it. That's it. That's it. That's it. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Bowser has goons that could easily capture Mario. The fucking sun, okay? The sun.
Kong hack in which Pauline works to save Jumpman, Mike Hoy's gender-bending version of Wind Waker, and Kenna Worthman.
What, did I say pronouns?
Mike Hoy's
Pronouns in 2012? Oh my God, you guys, how far back does wokeness go?
gender-bending version of Wind Waker, and Kenna Warzinski's Zelda starring Zelda, which transforms the princess into the protagonist. This practice of gender hacking game ROMs has actually been around for decades, offering enterprising players the chance to play as a female version of Mega Man or as Princess Peach rescuing Mario with her mermaid power. And thanks to the internet, game mods and emulators are now much more widely accessible. Gender hacks like these illustrate how
Wow, based Anita shouting out emulators.
female characters taking on the role of heroic rescuer can directly challenge the status quo and interrupt the established male-dominated pattern in gaming. That said, I don't necessarily think equal opportunity damseling is the answer. Simply reversing the gender roles of a problematic convention so that more men are damseled in more games is not the best long-term solution, even if the practice might be subversive in the short term to help demonstrate a very real gender disparity in the medium. Ultimately, we need to think beyond the cliché altogether. Over the past several years, we've seen an explosion of independent development, with many new titles drawing inspiration from classic-era games. This is an exciting and vibrant trend with enormous potential for innovation. But have games produced outside of the mainstream studio system managed to break the gender mold and avoid damseling? Well, we see the trope reproduced in indie, mobile, or retro-inspired games like Gish, Castle Crashers,
Yes, what the fuck?
Inversion, Machinarium, Super Meat Boy, Robot,
Your boy fucking hard, dude.
I Must Run, Flying Hamster, Rochard,
John!
Skylar, you okay?
Sideway New York, Zach Zero,
Okay, Anita.
Beans Qu-
All right, Anita. All right.
Werewolf,
Okay. Okay.
DLC,
Okay.
Fist Puncher,
Anita, I get
Time
it.
Thief.
Okay. All right.
Recycle the excuse plot ad nauseum. Far from being a thing of the past, the trope now appears to be more popular than ever. And since mobile, indie, and retro-inspired games are built upon a legacy of inequality in the media,
Like, no shade to Anita. Yes, there's a lot of fucking games that still do this. Because unfortunately, that was what happened with the initial run of platformers. So that becomes a staple.
the new wave of 80s and 90s nostalgia has brought with it the resurrection of the worst of the old school
Yes.
damsel in distress stereotype. Indeed, many of these new titles essentially function as love letters to the trope, as a way of paying homage to classic games of years gone by. This approach is no doubt intended as a kind of shallow meta-commentary on the tired old convention, suggesting developers are only employing the trope because the games that inspired them did so.
Exactly what I
But this
just
type
said.
of ironic self-awareness does not challenge or disrupt what the damsel in distress trope says about the role of women in such narratives. Fat Princess, Horde, Dokuro, and the aforementioned Spelunky
What about
all
Braid?
include
Does she do
patronizing
Braid?
damsel jokes built right into the gameplay mechanics, which turn damseled characters into very literal objects, instead of just narrative ones. In Spelunky, the damsel can be knocked out, picked up, carried around, and thrown at enemies, before rewarding the player with an extra heart via a smooch of victory. If you manage to get her limp, unconscious body to the end of each level while still alive, that is.
Yeah, I know Braid was that. That's why I'm saying I wonder if she's going to mention Braid as like a subversion.
Fat Princess is essentially one big game of capture the flag, but with princesses instead of flags. Teams of up to 16 players work together to rescue their kidnapped princess from the enemy's castle, before the opposing team can save their own princess from your castle. Even worse is the other game mechanic, which allows players to feed their captive princesses slices of cake. The more she eats, the heavier she gets, and the more difficult for the other team to carry her back to the...
Okay, I'm going to say something. Yes, obviously, this is playing with the trope of rescuing a princess, right? That we're all just here to rescue the princess. I know that's what she mentioned. And then there's also the layer of low-key fat phobia. But there's also a hidden layer of this is some feeder shit. This is a feeder fetish. The people behind this game, and they're barely disguised fetish, okay?
Their own base. Her voice also becomes deeper and less traditionally feminine sounding the bigger you make her. Players are meant to find all of this hilarious, of course, so the entire premise of this game is basically built around one big sexist fat joke. Sometimes this type of self-referential humor is referred to as ironic sexism. It's the I know that you know that I know this is sexist, wherein the underlying assumption on the part of media makers seems to be that as long as the sexism is overt, obvious, or over the top, then it somehow loses its cultural power and is suddenly no longer a problem. Ironic sexism is dependent upon the false assumption that people no longer really hold retrograde sex.
Yeah, I was gonna say this sort of thing only works in a society in which we've moved past this, right? That's the same reason why people say we're like post-racial. We're not post any of this shit. So like, it would be better if we were. Then we can make games like this. No, we care. But sadly, we don't live in a society. We live in a society.
And therefore, the very idea of sexism is now just a hilarious joke. But nothing could be further from the truth. Words like parody and satire are often thrown around to describe or defend these comedic depictions of yet more helpless female characters. But a simple wink and nod to the audience acknowledging a sexist trope, while actively reproducing that trope, does not automatically grant a free pass to continue exploiting the trope.
You call this a rescue?
Who said I was here for you, princess?
Every medieval fairy tale ever written?
More often than not, the ironic humor is just an excuse used by developers as a way to try and have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, it's similar to racism because it's a form of bigotry, you guys. So like, I'm not trying to be an asshole, but if something seemed like hard to parse, just think of it through her terms of racism. Instead of this person being fat, imagine them being black or Asian or whatever, and then see if it still holds true. Like, oh wait, they are othering someone based off of the inalienable like traits to them. Then it's like, oh shit. Like Fat Princess's whole thing is that she's a fat woman. That's the joke. Right?
So to speak. They want to use the trope, but not be held accountable for the inherent negative gender implications that come with it. Incidentally, a few games might have the option to play as a woman in multi-character lineups, but just because you could choose to play her, does not mean that this is then magically okay. A handful of other games attempt to get away with reproducing the damsel in distress by offering the ability to unlock and play as the damsel character, but typically only after the game has first been completed with the default male hero. However, these types of token role reversals do absolutely nothing to diminish the issues inherent in using the trope in the first place. Now, of course, some of the games we've been discussing may also be well-made or super fun to play, aside from their regressive gender representations. But the widespread resurrection of old-school...
And that's the part that I think a lot of people, both now and before, always glaze over. Shit like this.
Aside from their regressive games we've been discussing may also be well-made or super fun to play, aside from their regressive gender representation.
They may be well made and super fun to play. This is something that I harp on a lot too. People think if a game is well made and fun to play, then you can't criticize it. You can't acknowledge that, damn, this game was a banger. Weird that they were kind of racist, but this game was fucking amazing. Right? You can't be like, I had the time of my life playing this game. And also be like, but they do have some pretty regressive ideals when it comes to relationships. Notice how every relationship was just a hetero one that was good and all the non-hetero ones were bad? Like, you can't acknowledge that. What, you're saying the game's bad? No. What I'm saying, though, is there are certain themes and narratives in this game that I felt were either regressive or undercooked, but that doesn't make the game bad. And this is, in the nutshell, what everyone did to Anita. She had criticisms about the gaming genres or gaming as a whole, right? In reference to their portrayal of women. And people didn't even want to admit that we portray women terribly. Like, that's the reality we were living in. That in our media, we couldn't admit that women drew the short end. We couldn't do it. That's why she got so much fucking hatred too. They couldn't even admit basic things. Again, if I made a series talking about how black people were treated, or just racism in gaming, and how minorities were treated throughout gaming history, imagine someone trying to say, what? We never treated minorities bad. You know what I mean? You'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, if we can't even agree on this point, then you're living in a different reality. If you can't agree that women in our media, because it's reflecting our society, were treated poorly, then there's no reality which we can inhabit. We cannot share this reality. You can't look at movies like fucking Weird Science and be like, women were never treated poorly. There was no sexism. You're just reading into it. Like come on. We have entire staples of TV shows that were built around the fact that the women were either ball and chains and nagging. The whole I hate my bitch wife thing, right? That's a staple. That was a staple in American TV shows. So to be like, oh, that doesn't exist. To be like in video games, women weren't treated like objects. That's crazy. It's crazy to pretend that was not a reality. And that speaks to nothing about the quality of the games, mind you.
But the widespread resurrection of old school style damsels in distress is still an unfortunate trend because it's absolutely possible to create indie games that appeal to the retro feeling of the 8-bit or 16-bit era without regurgitating the helpless woman as plot device. There are other ways to pay homage or shout out to the past through art style, gameplay mechanics, or level design. Games like Sword and Sorcery, Where's My Heart, and Fez are all beautiful and creative retro-style games that appeal to a sense of nostalgia without replicating or falling back on the damsel in distress. Of course, games attempting to make light of the damsel in distress are not limited to recent indie games, but are part of a long tradition in the medium that continues today with popular mainstream titles like Rayman Origins and Ghost Trick Phantom Detective for the Nintendo DS. Since
I don't know about Ghost Trick. Is
often confused for subversion or deconstruction in our current media culture, let's take a moment to unpack the various ways humor has been employed in relation to the trope. In the 1994 platformer Earthworm Jim, the woman in peril waiting at the end of the game is officially called Princess What's-Her-Name, a reference meant to humorously acknowledge the fact that many damsel characters in classic-era titles were so unimportant that they either remained unnamed or were otherwise entirely unmemorable. So, the developers of Earthworm Jim noticed that sexist trend, thought it was hilarious, and proceeded to make another game in which a woman is completely unimportant. To add insult to injury, when Jim finally reaches Princess What's-Her-Name and is preparing to
Fez, I know.
collect his reward, she is randomly killed by a falling cow. The bad ending of the indie game Aversion features a similar joke. When the hero finally reaches the princess, She turns into a monster and eats you alive. A similar endgame punchline can also be found in Castle Crashers. After you've saved the fourth princess and then fought and killed your friends over who gets to claim her, it turns out that she has a horrible clown face.
That would not stop men. I'm sorry. That would not stop men.
In each case, the joke derives from the fact that after completing the long and perilous journey to save his woman, our hero is hilariously cheated out of his rightful reward. In other words, the comedy comes at the damsel's expense. These titles may be attempting to make fun of gaming conventions like the heroic rescue or the smooch at victory.
I love
But they
clown
don't
girls. I know.
fundamentally change,
That's what I'm saying. Good work.
challenge, or subvert the damsel in distress trope itself. The damseled women remain as disempowered as ever. Now, some will no doubt contend that jokes have no cultural power or significance and should just not be taken seriously. This is nothing new.
That's
Making
not true,
light of
though.
and dismissing gender issues is a sad, time-honored
That's not
tradition.
true, though.
But I would argue that this reaction fundamentally misunderstands how humor functions as one of the primary means by which the culture of sexism is maintained and perpetuated. Mass media entertainment doesn't just reflect our culture, it also works to create it. Sexist jokes in particular serve as a form of cultural permission, which help entrench toxic pre-existing attitudes and opinions. Of course, humor can also be a powerful tool with which to challenge or break down harmful gender myths, but that is much harder to pull off and must be done with careful intentionality. There is a clear difference between sexist parody and parody of sexism.
I will also say, I think a lot of game writing back then just wasn't good. For what they were trying to do, I think a lot of it just wasn't good. I think we've gotten a fuck ton better at it. But I think, given the fact that the time it came out, a lot of it just wasn't good. It wasn't good enough to do it in a way that felt like it was actually subverting it and not just lampshading.
Sexist parody encourages the players to mock and trivialize gender issues, while parody of sexism disrupts the status quo and undermines regressive gender conventions.
I've come to stop you from marrying Governor Marley.
So, for instance, when wannabe pirate Guybrush Threepwood finally reaches the kidnapped Elaine Marley in the 1990 adventure game The Secret of Monkey Island, she already has a plan to escape and he ruins it with his attempt to rescue her.
Oh, Guybrush, you mad fool! I'm impressed you came to rescue me, but it really wasn't necessary.
Like, this is obviously an exception.
The joke ends up being directed at the protagonist, rather than making fun of the damseled woman. There's been much discussion over the ultimate meaning of the 2008
I told you that you
Braid,
had to mention
but
Braid.
it's notable as an example of a more dramatic game that plays with the trope. Although the narrative is somewhat abstract, it eventually becomes clear that the damsel has actually been trying to get away from the protagonist the whole time. Both of these games offer some interesting commentary on the heroic rescue.
Yeah, Monkey Island is what it was
Monkey
the
Island
exception, by
asks,
the way.
What if the damsel is perfectly capable of orchestrating her own escape, and attempts to rescue her just make things worse? Braid asks, in part, what if by trying to save the damsel, it actually makes you the villain? While these types of games are a refreshing departure from the standard formula, and something I generally like to see more of, the focus is still squarely on the male characters, and so, at their core, these games are really deconstructing the player's assumptions about the traditional hero archetype. A true subversion of the trope would need to star the damsel as the main playable character. It would have to be her story. Sadly, there are very few games that really explore this idea. So as a way to illustrate how a deconstruction could work, let's try a thought experiment to see if we can create a hypothetical game concept of our own.
Oh, this I do
Like
remember.
many fairy tales, this story begins once upon a time with the kidnapping of a princess.
Because I think this was a tie-in to like a comic book she's working on.
She dutifully waits for a handsome hero to arrive
And says, I'm going to save myself.
Eventually, however, she grows tired of the damseling and decides it's high time she saves herself. Of course, if she's going to be the protagonist of this particular adventure, she's going to need to acquire a slightly more practical outfit. After her daring escape, she navigates the forbidding forest, leveling up her skills along the way. Upon reaching her kingdom, she discovers the inevitable yet unexpected plot twist. The royal council has usurped power and were responsible for her kidnapping. Branded a traitor and outlaw in her own land, she unlocks new disguises and stealth abilities to infiltrate the city walls. She makes her way through the final castle to confront the villainous council and abolish the monarchy forever.
Yeah, people got caught on that part when they're like, she's gonna get rid of monarchy forever. I'm like, it's a fucking video game, man. It's a video game, man. Also, I would play this game, but it would need to be like a more like a Dishonored immersive sim for me.
A story idea like this one would work to actively subvert traditional narrative expectations. The princess is placed in a perilous situation, but instead of being made into the goal for a male protagonist, she uses her intelligence, creativity, wit, and strength to engineer her own escape, and then become the star of her own adventure. Now, I'm certainly not arguing that all stories must include completely fearless, hyper-individualistic, heroic women who pull themselves up by their bootstraps and never need anything from anyone.
And yet that is the framework that all the criticism of people like Anita get, right? You guys just want all women to be this and this. Like when I tell you guys that Gamergate completely broke people's fucking brains and how we're still dealing with that, this is what I mean. So many things that she has said in these last, like, what, 2-3 videos, where she looks into the camera and says, now this isn't what I want per se, but there's a larger talk. They completely ignore all of this. They completely ignore all of that and go, she just wants all these women to be the exact thing she said that she didn't want. Because that's an easier argument from the fight against.
Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
Jade! Hang on, Jade! I'm coming! Free yourself, Jade! I'll create a diversion!
The human impulse to help others in need is certainly not a negative.
But what about the hitman thing? I know.
It only becomes a problem when acts of altruism are repeatedly presented in heavily gendered ways that are bound up in harmful myths about women as perpetual victims and men as paternalistic saviors. In fact, cooperation and mutual aid are concepts that hold an enormous amount of gaming potential. True co-op games, MMOs, and some RPGs offer gameplay possibilities that, if done right, can facilitate a mutual aid-style adventure involving people of all genders cooperating. Whereas My Heart and Thomas Was Alone both employ innovative examples of mutual aid by having a single player control multiple characters working together towards a common goal. As we've established, the damsel in distress is part of a long tradition of mythological narratives dating.
The more I watch her, the more insane her hair seems to me. She hits and misses, but hits her spot on. Yes, exactly. That's what I was saying this whole time. Like, yes, it's hit and miss. She has misses, but when she hits, she hits. But because she hit, people focus more on the misses. That's where you get she was wrong about Hitman. Right, because she was wrong about it from a technical standpoint. But what she wasn't wrong is that there are women in that area who were just there to be strippers as background noise. She wasn't wrong about that. And yes, you could say, but you're in a strip club, but the game puts you there. Right? And that's not to say you can't have games at strip clubs, but you look at the larger context. It's the equivalent of making a typo and then everyone dismissing your entire thesis. Like, I could say, like, you know what? Fascism is a horrific form of government because it relies on othering of people and the subjugation of more people. And I spelled subjugation wrong. And you're like, you spelled subjugation wrong. Therefore, your thing about fascism, irrelevant. And it's like, come on, dude.
Back through the ages. But those historic roots are no excuse for the continued use of a trope that perpetuates regressive and patronizing myths about women. It's been 100 years since a woman was first tied to the railroad tracks in this 1913 Keystone Cops short.
And she wasn't wrong because she said the gamer was violence against women. She wasn't necessarily talking about points, and she wasn't attacking men or gamers. She was challenging norms and stereotypes. Correct. But remember, I've told you guys in the past, the gamer identity is tied it's intrinsically tied to the games. So to critique a game is to critique them. The gamer brain wasn't developed. That's why if they have, even today, If you criticize a game, they attack you for it. If you like the wrong game, they attack you for it because their entire identity was tied to this.
And it's been over 3 decades since the hit arcade.
Again, earlier when I was talking about, we showed her, if you guys weren't here, I showed her speech at the UN, her and Zoe Quint. People were framing that as her saying she wanted to silence her critics when the entire speech was literally about harassment because they conflate harassment and criticism. Same thing happening here. They conflate any critique about the game industry or gamers as an attack on them themselves.
Game Donkey Kong helped entrench the damsel in distress as a default motivation for male heroes in video games as a medium. Yet, here we are, still seeing the same old cliche trotted out again and again. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern, break the cycle, and create new gender paradigms.
And that, to me, that's not crazy. Most people, by the way, only watch this video. Like most people only really watch this video and they watch the Mr. Man one or the Mrs. Male one. You can tell by the views because each successive video, she got like 100,000 views, 600,000 views, she was getting 1 million. They only watched the first like 2. And then they just said, oh, fuck it.